So in 1818, there was a little baby boy born onto a plantation in Maryland. He was born into slavery. He was tragically ripped away from his mother, and he was raised as a slave. And for his entire childhood, slavery is all that he ever knew. Then something remarkable happened when he was 12. His owner, his master's wife, was named Sophia at the time, and she began to take this slave boy and teach him how to read. She began to teach him his letters and how to read, and she was hiding this from her husband, but when her husband found out, he said, if you teach that slave to read, there will be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. And he was exactly right. You see, the little boy heard his master say this to his wife, and it sparked a thought in this boy's mind. This boy that had only ever known slavery. He realized for the first time in his life, maybe I have a choice. Maybe I have a choice between freedom and slavery. Maybe I don't actually have to be a slave anymore. A few years passed, and the boy continued to grow up. He began to read, and he began to learn, and eventually, just a few short years later, he chose freedom. Under cover of darkness, he escaped from the plantation one night, and he ran to a train, and he hopped the train, and he escaped slavery, and he became free. He went on to be one of the leading voices that ended slavery in our nation. His name was Frederick Douglass. This boy who had only known slavery had this light bulb moment when he realized that freedom was a choice and that he no longer wanted to be enslaved. This morning in Galatians chapter 4, Paul is going to use this very interesting metaphor of slavery to talk about spiritual enslavement, but to tell us that we don't have to be enslaved spiritually, that we can choose spiritual freedom. That just like Frederick Douglass, in a physical way, in a spiritual way, we have a decision to make between spiritual enslavement and spiritual freedom. You see, people are spiritually enslaved all around us. And I bet you have felt the pull of spiritual enslavement on your own soul, or you've even seen it in others. Maybe you've seen someone enslaved to a substance. Have you seen that? I think we all have. Maybe you've seen someone enslaved to image, needing to impress other people. Maybe you've seen someone enslaved to thinking they've got to be a really good person, follow all the rules to earn God's love. There's all these things, money and possessions and materialism, we can be enslaved to. But this morning, Paul wants us to have a light bulb moment and realize we don't have to be enslaved anymore, that we can live in spiritual freedom. So to make that choice, he's going to begin to tell us this in Galatians chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2. He says, what I'm saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he is no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, the heir is subject to the guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. If you're going to understand this chapter, basically what you have to get is that Paul is going to use the example of two people, and he's going to contrast these two people, okay? So if you're going to understand it, get this in your head. He's going to contrast a slave and a son. These are the two characters in the chapter, a slave and a son, all right? So think of like an ancient, rich, wealthy household in the first century in the Roman Empire, right? And you've got these two characters. You've got a slave, and that slave, well, you're not in charge of yourself, are you? You're owned by someone else. Your life is dictated by another, and so you are enslaved. You don't have freedom. But then this other character is the son of the wealthy household. And in theory, the son has freedom and is the heir of the inheritance, right? And is loved and is part of the family. So think of these two characters, okay? Now, Paul is going to give us one of the only exceptions to this. It's kind of confusing to us, but see, he's writing in the first century to the Galatians who are culturally Greek. And in the Greek culture, what would happen is if you were from a very wealthy household and there was going to be an inheritance, and your father died, because people lived like 35 years back then, which I am well over already, right? Been long over for me. So if your father died and you were still a child who was under 18, well, there'd be someone placed over you. There would be an epitropos, a guardian that would be put over your life. And so you're supposed to be this son, but until you turn 18, you can sign up for citizenship and receive your inheritance. You might be the son of the household, but you're not actually in charge of your life. Somebody else is. This guardian is. And so Paul is using this one exception to the rule of sonship and slavery to tell you that even a son can live like a slave. Even a son can live like a slave. And just to note, we're going to be using this language of son because it's what Paul uses, but I believe that absolutely Paul is talking about being a son or daughter of God, and I think you can trace that to Galatians chapter 3. Last week, we were talking about being a child of God, right? So when you hear son or daughter of God in this chapter. Verse 3, so also when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. So before you have faith, if you don't have faith in Jesus, Paul is saying it's like you're a slave. Because there's the other things in the world that are really in charge of your life. They're really going to dictate your life, dictate your beliefs, dictate how you live, dictate everything, right? And you've seen this. Some people are enslaved to all sorts of things. Have you seen people enslaved to a political party, a political group? You've seen people enslaved to image and making people impressed by them. You've seen people enslaved to, like we said, substances, materialism, and without Christ, we're all enslaved to something. I want you to think, whether you're a person of faith or whether you're trying to figure it out, I want you to contemplate, what is the thing that you're most tempted to be enslaved by, to run your life, to be dictated to by, to have really in charge of? We all have something, that thing we're tempted to be enslaved by, but we don't have to be slaves because Jesus Christ, God himself, came in the flesh, as we're told here in Galatians 4, to redeem us from slavery. And not just to set us free in kind of we're finally free sense, but to set us free into the adoption of sonhood. We're not a slave, we're a son. Verse 6, because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's children. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. If you are someone you've put your faith in Jesus, well, you're an heir. You're an heir, and your inheritance is the grace that God gives you. You don't have to keep trying to live up, to perform, to think you can earn God's love, but that you have been given grace and God's love unconditionally. And that you can know him now and forever because of Jesus' death and the grace he gives. You have been set free. You are no longer a spiritual slave, Paul says. But here's the problem that Paul is pointing out so far in this chapter. He says, even a son can live like a slave. So you can become someone who's like, yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I want to follow Jesus. But you can have this mindset of a slave, and you can kind of keep going back to these things that tempt you, whatever that thing was for you, that tempt you to live in a spirit of enslavement. Even a son can live like a slave. Following the Civil War in the United States, the slaves were finally set free. But something curious happened to a handful of the slaves. There was a slave in the state of Virginia. His name was Uncle Mose, and by the time the Civil War was over, Mose was a very old man. He had been born in slavery. He was born to generations of slaves. He had lived his entire life in slavery, and so when they said, hey, you're free, Mose didn't know what to do with himself. All he had ever known was slavery. What was familiar was what was comfortable for him. So while many of the other slaves left their plantations and went and sought freedom, Mose went back to his master and asked him if he could sign a contract to remain his slave. Now, why would he do that? It's because he all he knew. It's the same decision we make. Many of us, we make this decision to follow Jesus, but then we still get enslaved by all this other stuff in our life, right? Why do we do that? Why do we become sons and daughters of God, but we're still living like we're enslaved by this other stuff? Well, it's because it's all we know. Like Moses, what we're familiar with, and so we return to it. Even a son can live like a slave. Verse 8, formerly when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods, but now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I've wasted my efforts on you. Like we said, Paul's not super politically correct. He's like, I wasted my time on you guys, didn't I? If you are not serving God, then you're enslaved to something that is not God. And so the hope and prayer that God has is that you would come to him, put your faith in Jesus, be redeemed by Jesus, find the grace and the freedom that only Jesus can offer you. But why in the world, after all of that, after the adoption of sonship, after becoming a child of God, would you then return to slavery to the world? That's what Paul is asking these people he's writing to. You see, he's writing to a real group of people in this place called Galatia. And what they were struggling with is that Paul had just come through months, within the last months, years in their area, and they had just come to faith. And so they had been adopted, they had become sons. But then there was a group named the Judaizers who came through after Paul, and they said, oh, actually, believing in Jesus isn't enough. In addition to believing in Jesus, you got to follow all my rules. And so what it did is it re-enslaved them. They went from being free to actually choosing spiritual slavery. And the thing is, we weirdly want to return to slavery. We have this weird want, we have this weird pull that even after we've put our faith in Jesus and we're adopted and we have sonship, we have this weird pull back to slavery. After 4 decades in prison, there was a man in Missouri who had gone to prison 40 years before for murder. His name was Paul Baroni. And he finally got released. After 40 years in prison, the man's finally released, and he goes from being in prison to having his freedom, and he goes out into the world, and he starts living, and it's just, he can't do it. He didn't know how to exist in freedom. And so one day, after spending too much time free and being so uncomfortable, he walked into a restaurant, and he held it up. But he was pretending. The gun wasn't real. The whole thing was fake. He actually pretended to hold it up so that he could go back to prison. He wanted to be arrested. He wanted to go back to jail. The newspapers all said that on his way out, he said, I just want to go back to jail. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, you would think after 40 years of being in prison that when you were set free, it would be the moment of your life. But there's this weird pull back to enslavement. There's this weird pull back to imprisonment. We face the same thing spiritually. We weirdly want to return to slavery. Now, whether you're enslaved to other people's opinions, whether you're enslaved to a substance, whether you're enslaved to materialism, whether you're enslaved to money, whether you're enslaved to a political party, whether you're enslaved to a bad habit, whatever enslaves you now, when you come to Jesus and you find that freedom in being a son or daughter of God, those things that once enslaved you are going to keep speaking your name. And they're going to keep trying to pull you back to enslavement. And we weirdly want to return to slavery. Verse 21. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise. These things are being taken figuratively. The women represent 2 covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. Verse 31. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but the free woman. Now, that makes no sense to us. But I want to tell you Paul's point, and then I want to explain it. The spirit of sonship inherits freedom. The spirit of slavery inherits bondage. So what Paul does is he's trying to illustrate this point, right, of slavery versus sonship and freedom. And so what he does is he takes us back all the way to the year 2000 BC. And this guy named Abraham, the shepherd Abraham, is out in the wilderness, and God comes to Abraham and he promises him a son. Now, Abraham is an old man at this moment, so he struggles to trust God. And as the years pass and he doesn't have a son, he stops trusting God. So what Abraham does is he takes his wife's slave, Hagar, and he has a son named Ishmael. And so Paul's point is that that's the son of slavery and sin. But of course, God is faithful, and so by Genesis chapter 21, Sarah, Abraham's wife, does have a child, does have a son. His name is Isaac. And so Paul's like, that's like the son of freedom. That's the son of sonship. So Paul uses this story to illustrate how our sin leads us to live with a spirit of slavery, like Abraham lived when he was having this child with Hagar, the slave. But God's promise leads us to live a life of freedom, just like God's promise to give him this son, Isaac. So the spirit of sonship inherits freedom. The spirit of slavery inherits bondage. Now, one of the interesting things of Scripture is, when you're reading through Scripture, you see the numbers, the chapter headings, right? Now, in most of the books of the Bible, those were not in the original manuscripts. Right? It was about the 1200s that in the New Testament you get the chapter divisions and all that, so which means it's not a part of the originals, but it's really helpful because you got to know where in the world you are when we're talking about Scripture. But I actually think that Paul's idea here in chapter 4 gets wrapped up in the first verse of chapter 5. And so if none of that made sense, listen to this verse, okay? Galatians 5, verse 1. Christ has set us free for freedom. Therefore, stand firm and don't submit to the bondage of slavery again. You get to select to live as a son or a slave. And I love this verse. Yeah, even a son can live as a slave. And even a son has these pulls back to slavery and sin. But Jesus did not die for you to keep on living as a slave, did he? Christ has set us free for freedom. Therefore, stand firm and don't submit to the bondage of slavery. This is the point of the chapter. All this is confusing you, this is the entire point, this verse and this truth, that you get to select. It's your choice. You get to select whether you're going to live as a slave or a son and daughter of God. You get to choose. It's up to you which one you're going to live as. Okay. So when I was writing this message, I got to this point, and I was like, cool, we're done, right? Because I was like, that explains it. Like, that's what he's getting at. And then I was like, so what? What? It wasn't making a difference in my heart. And maybe that's where you're at, too. You've read this whole chapter now, and you're like, how does that actually change how I live? Like, how does that actually change how I see myself and how I see God and my relationship with God? What in the world does this mean to be a slave or a son? And so to explain this, I realized that it didn't make sense to me until I started using my imagination. So I want you to use your imagination with me for like the next 5 minutes, okay? And I'm telling you, you'll get why this matters and how it can actually change how you view God and change how you view how God sees you and loves you, and how big and stark of a contrast there is between living as a slave and living as a son. So use your imagination to go all the way back to the first century when Paul is writing, right? And you are showing up to a big party, right? Probably in a toga. I don't know what you would actually wear, right? You showed up to this party, and you're living in Galatia where he's writing, and you get this invitation to the biggest party of the year. And the governor of Galatia is throwing the party. It's going to be at his home. This is the richest guy in the whole state. It's like, oh man, this is going to be an awesome party. So you put on your best clothes, you go to this party, and you walk in the door, and it's late at night, and the party's already in full swing, and they spared no expense. I mean, it's loud and has the best entertainment, and a band is playing, and everybody's having a blast, and it's just the best food. And so you start to mull around, and you see a few friends, and you're having so much fun. And then you go into the courtyard in the middle of this party, and you look up, and the governor's right there. You're like, oh, man, I've never seen him. That's awesome, right? And so the governor's sitting over in this corner on his throne. And right by him is his son. And his son's sitting there, and the son's all decked out in Gucci, whatever they wore, right? Because he's the richest kid in the whole state. And so the son, the heir of the house, he's sitting next to his dad, right? And you're like, oh, man, that's wild. So the son there, like, I've never met the son. And you're kind of like, oh, this is so cool. I get to rub shoulders with these people. And so you're seeing the son, and the son's having a blast at the party. But then you catch something interesting. You see right by the son stands a slave. There's a slave that is one of the household slaves of the governor, and he's kind of standing by the side, just kind of waiting for commands. And you think this is interesting, right? Because, it's such a contrast. You have this son who's living in this wealth and this privilege and this, empowerment, and then you have this slave who is just kind of sulking in the background. And so you're like, that's really interesting. I'm going to get to know these two people tonight. And so instead of enjoying the party, or maybe this is just your weird way to enjoy it, I don't know you, okay? You decide, I'm going to get to know these two people. And I want to understand what makes them tick and what makes them different. And I think if you'll pay attention to what makes these two people at this party different, you will understand the difference it is to be a spiritual slave or a spiritual son in your life, and it will become real for you, okay? So I want to show you 7 contrasts between these two characters that will help you understand what it is to be a spiritual son or daughter of God. So the first difference is this. A slave is rejected due to their performance, but a son is accepted due to their position. So if you think about a slave, right? A slave, they know they're only like one. Have you ever been in a restaurant and a waiter is coming by and they do this and the whole tray goes, right? The slave knows they're only one mistake like that away from getting sent away. They're only one mistake. If they don't perform, they could be rejected. They could be gotten rid of. They could be sold off into someone else. And so what a slave does is they live with anxiety. And they live so worried that they're not going to perform. And they beat themselves up for every single mistake. It's a good picture of if you're a spiritual slave, and maybe you've done this. I know I've done this too. You make a mistake, and you beat yourself up. Have you ever been there? Man. It gets in your head for days or weeks at a time. How could I do that? Does God love me anymore? Is he going to get rid of me? I didn't perform. That's the spirit of spiritual slavery. And I think we've all felt it, right? But you see, over here, the son, when the son makes a mistake, what does he do? Well, he asks for forgiveness, but he knows he's forgiven. Not because of his performance, but because of his position. He knows that he is the son. He is the loved heir of the inheritance. He doesn't have this worry. He doesn't have this anxiety about performance because even when he messes up, he knows he's forgiven by his father. So he trusts the relationship. Second, a slave has a victim mentality, but a son has an empowered mentality. So you spend the evening trying to get to know these two people, right? And over here, you're getting to know the slave, the slave wants to tell you the story of all the wrongs that have ever happened, the bitterness that they still hold in their heart, the unforgiveness for the person's betrayed them, and how they got involved in all this and mess. And so they tell you over and over again this story of everything that's gone wrong in their life, and their identity really is rooted in this victimhood. That's like when we are spiritual slaves, we don't live in the empowerment of Jesus. We don't live as conquerors. When we're spiritual slaves, I bet you've gotten there. We throw ourselves pity parties. Have you been there, right? And you tell yourself over and over in this story because you can't forgive and you can't release these wrongs, and so you live this story of victimhood. But a son has an empowered mentality. So again, think about this party. You're getting to know the son. Does the son over here, who's the heir of the inheritance, does he spend all of his time at the party telling you about the wrongs of his life? No. I mean, wrongs have been done to him, but he's having a blast, right? He doesn't live in victimhood. No, he lives in empowerment. He's been empowered by his Father. It's like if we are followers of Jesus and we're living in our sonhood instead of our enslavement, we're living in by the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. And even when wrongs are done to us, we forgive and we put them in the past and we live as conquerors of Jesus, for Jesus. Another difference. Third, a slave works for their image. A son rests in their identity. So you're over here and you're getting to know this slave during the party. You realize they are really, really worried about what everybody thinks about them. Because if they don't look good to somebody, they know that person can go to their master and be like, he's out of here, right? And so what they do is any flaw they have, any mistake they had, they hide it. They don't want anyone to see. They want everyone to think they're perfect. They really work and they exhaust themselves and they enslave themselves to putting out a certain image. There are millions of people in our country who want to follow Jesus, but they're enslaved to image, to trying to impress people who want you to, they put so much work into social media. They make so much work into trying to hide their flaws. They put so much work into just making you think they're the perfect mom, the perfect dad, the perfect spouse, the perfect employee, but it's enslaving their hearts, right? Well, what do you think over here with the son? When people are walking into his party, do you think he looks out and he's really worried about what they think of him? Oh, no. You see, if you are living out spiritual sonship, spiritual daughtership in God, you're not worried about your image. You're not worried about what your neighbors and your friends and your family think about you, because what Jesus thinks about you is that you're loved and that you're redeemed. And when the Father loves you, you don't worry about your image. Fourth, a slave never feels like they have a place to belong, but a son belongs to a family. So as you're getting to know these two characters, right, the son and the slave, you realize that, there's such a tension in the heart of the slave. Because the slave spends all day, every day with this family, but they don't belong to the family. Isn't that a weird thing about slavery? But like you spend all day serving this family, but you spend all day around this family, but you're not part of it. You don't belong to it. There's millions of people in our country who want to follow Jesus, but they aren't a part of God's family. They're not a part of a church. They don't belong. They don't feel belonging to a church. They don't get involved, or when they do, they kind of fake it. They're not real. They're not genuine. They don't put the effort into knowing people and being known by people, and so they just don't feel like they belong. But the son, when he sits down at this party, and it's in his home, and people are only there because he's invited them, do you think he feels like he belongs? Yeah, it is his home. He belongs there. It's his family. When you are living out spiritual sonship, you'll have a church home, and you'll belong, and you'll belong to the family of God, and that sense of loneliness that belongs to the spiritual enslavement, it begins to go away. Next, number 5. A slave is motivated out of fear. A son is motivated out of delight. Okay, so back to the party, right? So you've got the son, he's sitting down, and the slave is here, and the dad is over here on his high throne. He's watching the party, and the dad's getting hungry, and the dad goes, "Give me a plate of food." And the son and the slave, they don't know who he's talking to. So both of them jump up, and they run to go get the food, right? But why? Think about what's in their heart, right? So the slave over here, why does he jump up and go get the food? Because he is avoiding punishment. It's fear. He's motivated to obey the Father. He's motivated to obey his master out of fear. He fears that punishment. He's terrified of the wrath, the anger. But why is the son getting up? Why does the son obey? Well, the son obeys because he loves the Father. The son obeys not because he fears the wrath and the anger, but because he wants the Father to delight in him. So you see, when you live in spiritual enslavement, oh, sure, sometimes you'll be able to rise to the occasion and obey God, but you're going to do it out of a fear of his wrath and anger. But if you're a spiritual son or daughter of God, if you're over here and you're living out this spiritual sonship in God, you'll obey God. You know why? Not out of fear. You'll obey God out of a desire to see him delight in your life. Like, there'll be nothing better. The reason you're motivated to obey God and to live a life that follows him is because you love him and you just want to see God happy. And you know that he'll delight in your life. Sixth, a slave lives in insecurity, but a son lives in security. You see, as a slave, as you're getting to know this slave, you know that the slave knows that the next day he could be sold. The next day he could be gotten rid of. That it could all be over. And so one of the things of slavery is there's this deep insecurity within a slave's heart. You know, one of the questions that I have gotten the most as a pastor for the last 2 decades is people who want to follow Jesus, who have been following Jesus for months, years, even decades, will come to me and be like, how do I know if I'm saved? I worry that I'm saved. I don't know. What is that? It's insecurity, right? But insecurity resides in enslavement. It's the spirit of enslavement. And that's why sometimes we worry about our salvation if you're a follower of Jesus, because we're still living in enslavement. But over here, do you think the son is worried that he's going to get sent away the next day? No, he can rest secure. He goes to sleep secure. You know, he's part of the family. And so if you have a spirit of sonship, you won't need to be worried about your security of salvation. You'll know that in Christ you are secure and saved. And then seventh, a slave lives to earn love. A son lives from love. So if you have this spirit, so back to our party, right? And if you're getting to know this slave and you realize that, man, what they would like better than anything is just to have their master be like, good job. To give him that pat on the back, doing good, I love you. Like, oh man, that would be amazing. And so how they try to get there is they try to be a really good slave. And they try to do all the stuff perfectly. And they think that that's how they're going to earn the love of the master. But they can never get there because none of us are perfect. That's like how you and I, when we try to earn God's love, when we think that we can make it to God by being a good person, by following the rules, that's how we earn his love, that enslaves us. Because none of us are perfect, and so our attempt to get what we cannot get to enslaves us. But over here, the son knows that the father loves him, and he's secure in that love. He's not trying to earn the love through his following of the rules. He knows he already is. And so he can go and live in freedom because he knows that regardless of the mistakes or the trials or the sufferings of his life, that he's going to be loved through all of it. And so if you're trying to understand this difference between a son and a slave, just imagine that party and imagine how remarkably different it is to be that slave and that son. And this is the point of Galatians 4. You get to select to live as a son or a slave. You get to choose it. And I bet as we went through all those things of the slave, I know there's for me that you've seen some of those things in your life and some of those pulls on your heart, and you want that freedom. You get to choose. So grasp the spirit of a son and give up the spirit of a slave. You get to select to live as a slave or a son. You know, in verse 4 and 5, Paul uses this same word, redeemed, a couple times. And this word redeem often goes over our head, but it's actually a word picture in the Bible of slavery. And so this word redeemed, it really gets at the heart of what it means to be a slave or a son. And here's the word picture. Every time you read this in Scripture, I want you to think of this story. This is what redeemed means. Imagine that you're back in the first century, and you walk into the bustling marketplace in the middle of the city. And there's thousands of people all there buying and selling things, but over in the corner of the market is where the slaves are being sold. And there's this big platform, and there's dozens, 100 different slaves are lined up that day, and they're each coming up on the platform one by one, and they're sobbing, and they're being sold, and there's an auction, and people are yelling out prices, and they're being sold off, and they have these shackles around their hands, and they have these shackles around their feet, and they're being sold off into slavery. And it breaks your heart. But you don't have the money to go pay for them. Into the marketplace walks a man. And he walks up to the stand, and he takes from his waist a big bag, and he turns it upside down. And as he does that, you see all these gold coins come out of the bag, and it's filling the table. These coins are spilling over the table. The guy can't contain it. And the man says, I will pay for them all. They are now mine. The money changers are all gathering the money, and the businessmen, they're all gathering the money. So the man that has just paid the price, he goes and he sees this row of 100 slaves, and they all believe that they've just been sold into a different farm, a different slavery, and they get ready to go, but instead he does something shocking. He goes down the line, he begins to undo their shackles one by one, and he breaks the around their wrist, the shackles, and he breaks them off from around their ankles, and as they're rubbing their hands and their feet, what is going on? What in the world is going on? Why is he taking off our shackles? And then the man yells to all 100 of the slaves, I bought you to set you free. Go in your freedom, go. I've paid the price, go. Half of the slaves, they come down and they surround the man, and they thank him, they fall at his feet, and they kiss him, and they're crying, and they're thanking him, and they're saying, we'll follow you, we'll do whatever you want, we'll just thank you so much for setting us free. But then you notice something really strange. The other half of the slaves, they're still in their places, and they pick their shackles back up, and they're trying to get them around their wrists. And as all those former masters file out of the market, they're running after them and say, don't leave me behind. Can I still be your slave? Take me back, please. You see, this is a picture of you and I. Jesus came and he paid the price, but it wasn't in gold coins, it was in his blood on the cross. He paid the price to set us free, to redeem us. This is what redeem means. You were once a spiritual slave, but now you've been set free. You've been adopted, as Paul tells us in Galatians 4. But so many of us, after we've been redeemed, after Jesus has taken off the shackles, forgiven us, loved us, we put the shackles back on. And we go back to all those things that enslave us. I don't know what it is for you, but we go back to those things. And Paul is simply saying, hey, you get a choice. You get to select to live as a son or a slave. The Son of God became a man so that men can become sons of God, not slaves to sin. Christ has set us free for freedom. Therefore, stand firm and don't submit to the bondage of slavery again. You get to select to live as a son or as a slave.